Hey, thanks everyone. Sorry about my delay. Back to back, it's amazing how days recently just are freaking crazy. I imagine every single one of you probably experienced that at one capacity or another. So if my board didn't get an opportunity to introduce me, I'm Frank Simorjay, the chapter president, but I'm also um, privileged access kind of specialist. I've been working at Microsoft for a little while, and in fact, over the course of, I'd say probably 2 years, produced a whole bunch of material associated with what does securing privileged access look like. Interestingly enough, the presentation tonight, and it's a small audience, which is great. I always want more people to learn about this, is what is it about the imperative associated with privileged access? Most people think about the fact that when I have privileged control over something like that, you're basically having to flip the I'm going to go security or I'm going to go productivity. There usually is very little blending between those two worlds. The concepts associated with bringing security and productivity together is something that is especially a difficult one when you think of the imperative associated with privilege control. Now, there's a reason for that, and that's because attackers like privileged access. I mean, that's one of the first things they seek out, and I suspect that the banter prior to me joining was probably somehow associated with privilege control over something. Attackers truly are like water. They will look for the easiest way in. I suspect all of you that has worked in security for a while is probably familiar with that. You know, there used to be a time, and I'll say from my youth, where gaining access or gaining control of something was just kind of something you did as a research, or you did it because it was cool. You know, owning something wasn't something about getting financial reward from it. It wasn't about anything in the scale of what we consider malicious behavior today. Reality of today, it's all about return on investment. You see attackers are purely in a mode where it's all about how can you actually establish yourself and actually make profit. I mean, because it is extremely profitable. So the thing about security then, it's about disrupting that process. How do you disrupt an attacker? How do you actually look at how they make money and disrupt that behavior? You know, again, I mentioned our corporation, and in fact, AWS and Google has taken a pretty aggressive position on disrupting the cost of attacking. That doesn't eliminate, you know, the individual players that maybe will just do something off a one-off type of attacks. But when you kind of start thinking of the bigger picture, think of nation state actors and you think of these big attackers, it is really that disruptive behavior that the cost of attacking gets so high that it's impractical. So what are the options? Well, the problem is right now attackers have a lot, and defenders have to create those protections. So when you kind of take a look at what does privileged compromise look like? Now think of your business critical assets. You know, I don't really care where it is, in AWS, in Google, business assets such as inside some of the other businesses like Honeywell, GE. So if you're thinking of critical environments, on-premise, CyberArk, SailPoint, doesn't matter what that critical asset is. It's the fact that you have certain things that you need to protect along that path. And we think about it, you know, from the user access, we're not going to even look at the privileged point. You have something, an endpoint device, your device that you're using right now, that's that workstation. You're going to have an account. You may have an intermediary, and that's that scale. We're kind of thinking of like VPN. Maybe open up a VPN, and you know, Joe on this call is Mr. VPN master. He tries to hide himself through what, a dozen VPNs sometimes, at least I've seen,
or more.
Or more. The reality is that you can create intermediary connections, And ultimately, you will get to an interface, which you hope from a user access perspective you have access to. Privilege fundamentally follows the same path. Now, the problem is attackers, I'm sorry, your basic fundamentals associated with that is that your identity systems are usually tied together. You probably have a common identity. You probably have a common authorization and elevation. The problem is attackers know that, and they take advantage of the fact that there's many entry points for them. You have to protect every single one. The attacker only has to compromise one. And that's that pivot that really becomes very, very difficult. So what do? Well, you create a pathway that really limits your privilege control. Now, this presentation, one of the things I have to note is obviously I do represent a company that produces most of these products, but it's irrelevant as to if you're using Microsoft products or if you're using something else. The reality is the technology and the concepts of processes are common to just industry. And that's one of the reasons, in fact, I'm really happy to be presenting this as an ISC2 event, because this is really relevant to, it doesn't matter what product you're using. If you're using cloud services, ultimately, you've got to think about this problem across the board. All right, come on, animation. All right, so end-to-end session protection. It really does require to create a zero trust environment. I started using zero trust about 2 years ago, and then marketing just got, they love the concept of zero trust. But what do I think of zero trust? It really comes down to three things. I don't trust my users. I don't trust the devices they use, and I don't trust the way they're going to come into my network. So what you have to do to overcome that and to continue to be able to manage your privileged environment is you have to build it. You have to build it from ground up. There's a cost to that. No question about it. If you want privileged protection, you have to start clean. So clean keyboard, clean users, clean connections. There is a cost to it. Fundamentally, there is no way around that. There's been a lot of discussions. I've read a lot of papers about, well, you can take a hybrid system and sanitize it, or you can take, your current environment, create basically a group or a tenant or a subsection. The reality is, if it's compromised, it's compromised. Clean means clean, which some organizations see this as a real difficult thing to overcome. You have to monitor. If you build out this end-to-end system, it's a clean environment. You have to monitor it. You also have to monitor and understand what your lateral connections are within that environment. Especially if you start clean, you start with a relatively fresh start. You'll understand what those accounts look like, and then be able to respond quickly if that compromise does occur to that environment. So what does a typical path look like? Well, we know that you got a workstation, you got accounts, intermediaries, and interface. But then what you have to do is actually start like layering on top of that. You start with an enterprise security type model. Cost is relatively low. You can then become specialized, which is going to be, remember, we're talking about your privileged path here. The specialized, slightly more expensive. And then privileged, which has got the highest cost. And when we talk about cost, it's not always about purely technology cost. There's a people cost involved in this too. You're taxing your users, you're changing their behavior. A lot of these things are very expensive when it comes to what you're thinking of lateral attack prevention in this ecosystem. However, if you follow some basic patterns, what you can do is really maintain some level of productivity in your environment and maintain the protections of the security. If implemented well, you'll make sure that the visible and invisible security, the boundaries are set very low to really hide as much of those controls from the user. Let me give you a couple of examples. What are some of these controls? Like removing administrative privilege from a user. That is a very visible action. Users hate that. I mean, out of the 13 people on this call, how many of you are not running as an administrator on your machine? Anybody want to be the guinea pig and say that you are not? My suspicion is every single one of you are probably running with some kind of elevated privilege on your machine. So that means that you unfortunately are utilizing controls that are very exposable, right? That's that invisible control. Do you want to give it up? Probably not. But now if I run your business, I probably want to take that away from you. Not because I don't trust you or I don't like you, but my business, your business depends on it. So let's look at what these three models are that we created in this capability, and provide a lot of guidance. And by the way, how do you actually move through this process? So in enterprise security, what you're actually introducing is this concepts of managed devices, managed accounts, intermediaries, and interfaces. And then as you move up the stack, you end up with a much more constraint and control. The advantage from an operator, from a business administrator, is you have better insight to your privilege. Your users tend to be a little bit more upset, right? So this is that thing when I was showing you on the last slide here, that further right you go, more control you have, the higher cost to your users. So we'll spend a little bit of time. This slide refers to a couple of things that are very Microsoft centric, the enterprise access model and ISA. I will not talk about those. I'll mainly focus on the end-to-end trust for access control. So going into each one of these, it's about what are the controls and what are the capabilities you need to consider. So for enterprise security, you need to make sure that you have productivity administrators, managed policies, monitoring, and capabilities associated with how you deploy your profiles for your devices. As you move into specialized, this is that gap. And let me, in case I missed this hop here, I'm talking about how do you build a device? How do you build a laptop in this model? On the left side, it's productivity capability. It's much more mixed. What we tend to think of is managed device. So for Microsoft, that's using our Intune capability or MDM capability. There are plenty of other open source solutions in this market that allow you to so-called manage devices. That's kind of the first step. Specialized. This is where now you manage that device, but you also restrict the local administrative capabilities. You block application installation. You monitor what's being installed. Doesn't mean that you won't allow. I have maybe a separate session. I'll talk about in Microsoft, specialized security is the model that I use in a very specific deployment. We deployed this to our users and they are using it today. It's actually kind of funny. I had a conversation earlier today about somebody going, oh, so that's what you guys deployed. I'm like, yeah, very particularly the specialized security model. So that stack that you're looking down the middle there, I actually have an actual deployment of that I'm managing on a day-to-day basis. And why did I not go with the privileged security? Is because it really does restrict your systems considerably to a point where users may not be able to function effectively. In my environment, I have applications that I need to run that I would consider potentially low security. But I had to take that risk on primarily because I need to be able to operate my business. So again, there's a balancing act that you have to take a look at. And originally when we published this, we were talking about 5 levels, and you kind of like progress through it. And recently we had some really smart people come to me and go, but you know what? Too many choices. Make it simple. Three options. You have standard users, you have high impact users and developers, and you have IT operations specific that maybe require these advanced controls and restrictions. Now, if what I'm talking about doesn't really gel with your thoughts, I'll give you a link. We have lots of definitions and descriptions as to what exactly each one of these elements mean, and what does it actually, how does that pertain? And in fact, actually, there's the link. So it's aka.ms/PA, has some great additional detail that maybe as a presenter, I'm just not hitting on all the right notes to be able to describe. But what again, let's look at it from the attacker's perspective. So On the enterprise side, there are defenses that are built into this model. You can prevent against supply chain attacks, ERD evasion, some basic capabilities like that. As you move up to specialized, now you have prevention against things like supply chain 0-day, sophisticated physical attacks too. And think when you take away that local admin right, one of the big attack vectors that you can prevent against is phishing. All of a sudden, your specialized security model is phish proof. 100%? No. I'm a security guy, just like all of you. I can never say for a fact that 100% of phishing will be prevented. I can say with extremely high confidence, phishing is very difficult to virtually impossible in this model. On the privilege side, you get even further. So now, and one of the things that is the supply chain. I'm sure all of you are familiar with SolarWinds. That occurred just earlier this year. If you had a privileged model like the one I'm describing here, and the enterprise specializer privileged element, it would have prevented your organization from suffering any damages from SolarWinds, period. That is an attestation that we can make in privileged security, right? The idea is that you're removing the ability for that application to be able to execute in a way that, again, the SolarWinds attack, I'm very familiar with how it operated and with some of the things it did. I will not go into details because, again, this isn't about SolarWinds, but I'm telling you that there are some things that if implementation of this technology would really prevent against that. And the questions that come up, what I'm going to do is say, hey, Joe and Jean, hopefully you guys can flag me if I need to try to answer something. I know I see some of the questions. You know what? I'll come back towards the end and hit on the questions at the end. So what are the control summaries? This is a high-level summary analysis of the different controls. Might address some questions too. Things like on the enterprise side, you allow, again, it's a much more functional and productivity-centric model. Specialized is much more controlled, and privileged is extremely controlled. So it's basically the PAW. I know somebody said, hey, that sounds like a PAW. And the answer is, yeah, it is the PAW. Privileged access workstations is meant to be much more restrictive. There's a couple of key things here about, it's like the trade-offs. And all businesses can make the decision is what is the trade-off of I can operate in a privileged mode versus this is just too hard and I need more than one laptop and I just can't make this work. So what you'll see is the difference here. Now, this is slightly Microsoft centric, and when it comes to product, we talk about this concept of MEM and autopilot. So key thing here is it's a managed solution. Autopilot is an auto deployer. So the principles associated with autopilot, I think that it's in this slide here. This is a piece of technology that Microsoft, I don't know if we acquired or built. The principle is that it's a supply chain managed hardware. When I purchase a device from, let's say, Dell or HP, I pre-register my ecosystem. And here, what's really important to point out is that I'm going to basically provide my AD information to my manufacturer. And when I fulfill that purchase and receive that device, so now you're looking at that Windows 10, 20H, maybe 19H device, it has all of the correct components automatically built. I have confidence that that device, when I first use it, wasn't compromised. So some of the concerns I'm really worried about is, let's say I bought a laptop from Dell and the FedEx carrier decided to open that case and put some kind of a keylogger onto the system. So he's got some smart bits, he puts it into the OS. By the time I receive it, I log in, it's a compromised environment. Because obviously once you have the device, everybody knows on this call, physical access to a device almost guarantees compromise from an attacker's perspective. Well, in the autopilot path here, what we do is we're going to stamp it at the manufacturer. So Where could I compromise? I could compromise on the production line in China of all places. Yes, it could happen. The chances of that, relatively, I hope, low. There have been some recorded cases, but again, they're very extreme. So I got a manufactured device from HP or Dell. It was manufactured in China. The TPM, the trusted platform, was stamped with my particular key that's associated with my AD stamp. When it delivers to me, I'm able to do that first-time authentication. It validates the fact that nothing's been altered, including the physical substrate at that point. E.g., the battery wasn't replaced, the TPM wasn't reset, the UEFI BIOS settings weren't modified. When I log into it, I have a really high confidence that that device has not been tampered from manufacturer. I log into it. Those policies that I was talking about, the 3 levels, now I pull down all my privilege policies, I figure it, I deploy it. That device, I have a very, very high level of confidence that it is what I think it is, and I can now allow privilege to occur on it. As in, I can manage my AWS or my Azure tenant information on it, put in my password, and not feel, in that higher rate of my gut-wrenching condition that computer that you're using and typing in those keys in is being watched by somebody who you really don't want to be watching. Obviously, there's a couple of other things associated. We talked about the device itself. Well, we also have to make sure we protect the account. So how do you create an account in a clean room fashion? Well, one is you have to implement some capabilities associated with that, such as good quality MFA. You have to make sure you have enforcement and monitoring that transaction. As we go through a specialized, and unfortunately now this is where it becomes expensive, is tagging actions. This is now data classification associated with that, and allowing your identity system to actually participate with your classification model. Ensuring that there's a response tied to that. And on the privilege side, it's making sure that things like specialized capabilities of the identity system you're using are being utilized. Microsoft has initiated things like some very interesting artificial intelligence-based knowledge in our account management. So I think the most commonly people hear about is the concept of fast travel. Fast travel means I logged into my laptop today from here in Redmond, Washington. Now, if in an hour from now, I logged into my computer, but I was physically located in Beijing, China, you should probably kind of wonder, how did I do that? Interestingly enough, the AD environment that I'm talking about, the Azure Active Directory environment, has now software that's smart enough to go, hey, you know what? That was really fast travel. If I did the best chance of traveling on the fastest plane, it would take me this many hours to get to China. So it is able to do one of two things at that point. Flag that account. Hey, you know what? Something's really going on. Notify the administrator. Hey, this user just did a fast travel, or block the account. So a lot of those capabilities, that's an example. Or logging in from multiple places all at once, right? Logging in from Bellevue, Redmond, Seattle. Wow, it all happened within a minute. Maybe a fast travel activity, but it's the simultaneous login activity. There's a lot of these types of scenarios that you can actually quantify and really the bad guys from being successful in the way they fish out and collect information about you. So what are the benefits? Obviously, as we go up the stack, is prevention of different types of attacks. Now, notice though that there's the inside coercion and extortion all the way up the stack. The reality is, if I were to kidnap and tie him up, put a knife to his fingers and say, type in your password now, I suspect he will. I know if I was coerced and forced to type in my password, give my MFA, I'd gladly for my company. I have no level of loyalty to that extent, and that's the reality. I mean, most of you, if you think that you protect your company and hides, I'd be a little suspicious. If you are, great, good for you. Maybe you work for the government. I don't know. Maybe you've taken some kind of an oath that says you will do that. Most of us, nah. No, we are here to do a job. We want to do security well, but coercion is some distortion, our view that the bad guys can continue using. And the reality is, doesn't matter what model, privileged model I provide, those really are by far the hardest ones to countermine. So let's look at some of the tools, though, that you can use as an organization to make that more difficult. MFA, obviously, good quality MFA. We've talked about the fact that passwords alone, doesn't matter how complex you make it. That's kind of yesterday's protection. Better is to have callback or SMS. A lot of products out there in the market do that. That's the good. There is to do push or TOT type or auth type capabilities. Not bad. Best these days is technology like YubiKey FIDO, Hello. These use TPM based, right? These are chip based control. They're much harder to coerce. They're much harder to extract if you don't have the right key. I mean, I'd say virtually impossible. And then authenticator tools. I mean, interestingly enough, Microsoft has it, Apple has it, and Google has an authenticator app. Those are becoming by far the gold standard for a means to have quality MFA. To Windows here is what does a good intermediate. Now, interestingly enough, in my perspective, to Joe's chagrin, this is yesterday's technology. Intermediaries are not necessary anymore. If you have, again, those first two stacks that I showed you prior, good control over your accounts, good control over your devices, VPNs are yesterday's technology. But there are some circumstances where maybe this is just something you see is absolutely necessary. So what are some of these intermediaries that I'm talking about? VPNs, PIM-PAM to jump servers, bastions, Azure AD PIM, or proxies. In all reality, all of these give you an ability to so-called break a connection and create a third component that requires to authenticate. But as I said, if you have a good MFA technology in place, this layer doesn't necessarily provide a huge security improvement, but it does one thing very, very well, is it makes your users very unhappy because you've added complexity to your network. Also, it's a cost thing, right? I mean, face it, it's like you're basically buying something that's going to be providing you these capabilities. It does help you reduce credential theft and manage device protection from exploitability. There are a lot of different capabilities in this space. I won't spend as much time talking about it, but if you kind of read through some of the material here, what I wanted to just kind of highlight is about protecting your escalation and privileged capabilities associated with how each one of these line up and what benefits you get along the path of a privileged device. Now, what's really important about this, though, is what is the attacker's option? Interestingly enough, when you kind of think about it, is that proxies and bastions and PIM, it reduces your attack surface. What's the value from the attacker? You can get connectivity. It's really hard, virtually impossible. Impersonations, virtually impossible. Stealing accounts, virtually impossible. ADP PIM, again, network connectivity is almost impossible. Impersonation is almost impossible. There are some account credential things that you can do inside there that can expose you, but not as prevalent. Now, what's interesting, though, is that with the VPN, jump servers, and third-party PIM-PAM solutions, the attack surface recently, and we're talking about the last 24 months, has expanded considerably, and it's mainly because of the fact that there's been some high-level credential and certificate thefts that have occurred that have exposed these third-party VPNs to being totally compromisable. Once I have your certificate for that VPN, as in I don't need to compromise your VPN, I need to compromise the manager of your certificate. If I get that certificate because it's a third party that you may not have control over. Because remember, they're probably not using privileged services either, right? Unless you're now running an entire PKI structure on your own, which is maybe, Joe, do you run your own PKI? Calling Joe out just because I felt like it. How about you, Gene? You guys run your own PKI?
Yes. On certain contextual systems.
Yeah, but
It depends on what I'm doing.
so who is your upstream provider? Not that I mean to like call you out
My
on the board.
ISP,
Yeah, no, well, no, your PKI upstream. So who's got your root certificate or the master certificate?
Okta.
Who?
Okta.
Okta. All right. So in January, a very highly predominant company was compromised. Their certificates were stolen. What if Okta was the next target and their certificates were compromised?
I'd be screwed.
What would happen? Evil thoughts. I'm not trying to call you out, Joe, but you're such a great candidate to have this conversation with.
I'm good with it.
As if it didn't happen to SolarWinds or anything like that. So on the security interface side, this is the last piece. And you know what? It's like, interestingly enough, I may have come in a little late, but the good news is that I was able to keep this presentation within a 45-minute window, which was always my intent. The last piece is secure interface. Is how do you interface with this environment? Obviously, you want to make sure that you have all the components built out for this. Is that you have intermediaries that are going to do this, including things like, if you think about APIs and all the different components associated with how you're actually connecting to that. There's some other things to consider is that secured interfaces include things like building a CI/CD, like a continuous improvement environment, and usually it's API based. Jump servers, again, yesterday's technology. If I jump to a client and I connect to it, I expose potential risks associated with making that jump. So the recommendation, I think that was actually, I thought I had another slide there. Let's go back to interfaces here. So having that built out in a way where I actually have access to the means to build the right components. Now, what's interesting is that it's funny because I'm thinking this is so light in my slideware, and that's because this is by far the most complicated piece to build out. Ultimately, you own applications, you own the interfaces. You have to build that bridging, especially if, let's say, you were to follow all the guidance I just provided about building a secure, privileged environment. Now you have interfaces you need to connect to. You have most likely broken your single sign-on environment, because again, it's like single sign-on is one of those areas that's really gray. How do you actually do privileged but manage? As a result, having a very good interface model is very complex, and every single person on this call, plus the folks that didn't join tonight, would have to spend time thinking about what does that look like. So how do you build your data workload planes when, let's say, you run something in ML, when you're doing application website development? How do you build all of that management capability in your privileged environment so that the users have access? And remember, we're trying to manage productivity, so you want to expose as much productivity in this effort. Those become really important so that your users have access to it, but your privileged access also can manage it, and manage it in a way where it doesn't become overly complex. So those are the layers of building a privileged access environment from top to bottom. And these are the learnings, in fact, actually we've taken. And as I said, in a future session, I'd be happy to actually discuss the so-called next phase of this, as in, here's all the principles that I presented. How does it look like in production? So we have, I actually built this out in production within Microsoft. And it'd be a great session that I could spend, again, another hour just talking about how did we actually apply this? How did we apply our CI/CD model? How did we apply that workstation model? How did we apply the account model? It is very Microsoft centric, since I do work for Microsoft and I do get all the services for pretty much for free. But the learnings associated with that may be extremely valuable. And I'd be more than happy to share that in a future session. So at this time, I'll kind of take a look at questions. I'll answer. If you have any questions to ask me, what I'll do is I'll open it up and let you bring it up. There's only 13 of you, 12 of you maybe. So please ask away, and I'll scroll up here and look at questions. Mitigating Microsoft Exchange server vulnerabilities. Yep. Run as privileges. Yeah, okay, great. Run as privileges still means that if I can somehow compromise and get inside that connection, and you still have a potential issue. But yeah, no question. Run as is fun. It's fundamentally.
I run as user.
One of the funny things though is that why is it? And I almost want.
It's still in LSAS. Run as is still in LSAS.
Why is it that Microsoft never implemented the Unix equivalency of a true run as?
You and I were there. We tried.
It's mind blowing. It really is mind blowing. And then you know what? It's like now, unfortunately, the new technology that you're dealing with on, every single one of you that's looking at your phone right now, think of it. You're running in a privileged mode. There may be a higher privilege. Ironically, your carrier's got one level above you, but you're still running in privileged mode. You get some warnings to say, hey, do you want to install this? But you have very little insight as to what actually is occurring behind the scenes. I do appreciate.
But you have app isolation that app has to ask root
user
to have access. Yes, the user, which is root. The app has to ask the user for privilege to get to other app container, which is Knox. Those apples. I can't remember apples.
Yeah, and it's basically a multi-tiered model too. But it's fundamentally still, it's like the minute you grant permission, and this is the reason. I mean, all you have to do is take a look. Take a look at iOS getting compromised. What did the attackers do? Remember I said is that easiest entry. So why attack the end user? Attack the store, right? I mean, compromise the store. And some of the compromises to the store is like, they're very clever. Somebody installs a backdoor to an app, or they place an app like a game and get it promoted, and then they have a backdoor. So the reality is, how many of these can Apple manage? I don't know. They've done a good job, though. Believe me, I total kudos to Apple. I give them a hands down kudos.
I think I give total kudos to all of the stores, the app stores.
Yeah, but it's a move from the Ring 0 access, right? I mean, if you think about it, they've kind of moved up to like Ring 2, Ring 3 type stuff.
1.5, 1.52.
Jump server alternatives. Yes, I'll give you jump server alternatives. Don't use them. Use a privileged access solution, right? Get away from jump servers entirely. Jump servers are just a middle ground for an attacker to compromise, and let alone the fact that if they figure out how to get into that stream, they have access to the entire path.
It adds It adds a beachhead for lateral movement.
Yeah. So what does a jump server do, though, from a security perspective? Because I know a lot of businesses out there use them. It slows an attacker down. So if you have really good monitoring, you have, I mean, very good monitoring. Jump servers can be very effective to give you enough time. You know, way back when I learned the term of OODA, right? Observe, orient, act, and detect.
Decide and act.
Decide and act, thank you. So what a jump server does is it gives you time to decide and act. That's really the really massive benefit. All right, so if questions, otherwise we're right at the top of the hour, and I will wrap it up then, I guess.
Have you ever heard of a solution to run a CA on a YubiKey?
What?
Certificate authority, a PKI certificate authority on a YubiKey.
All right, sure. Maybe it's tomorrow's technology that I don't even know about.
Security is hard.
Security is hard. And privileged access, like basically PAWS and privileged access solutions is definitely a good concept. And it doesn't matter what your privileged access is. Like, think about the fact that you should isolate those privileged work. It's one thing to do it for yourself. It's another thing to do for your company, right? It doesn't belong to you, I hope. Unless, even if the company belongs to you, does it really belong to you? All right. Thanks, everyone. Hopefully this was an entertaining and educational session. We will see you next month.